Welcome back to Give and Take. Joining us now is Kristen Mulvihill, co-author of A Rope and a Prayer and the wife of David Rohde. Kristen, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the things that I found most striking about the book and the case in general was the fact that you had to keep his abduction basically secret for 7 months. Talk to us about that process. Why did it have to be secret, and who were you able to tell?
We actually decided as a family that we wanted to keep it private. I personally felt David would not want to be part of a story. I was also very concerned that he would perhaps become the next Daniel Pearl if the case became public. Our family spoke with the New York Times, and they agreed to keep it quiet, which I think was the right decision. I know it went against every instinct they had as journalists to do that, but I really think it's one of the reasons he's alive today. Early on, the kidnappers called the bureau in Kabul of the New York Times, and they said, don't go public. So in the early weeks, everybody agreed to that, and then we sort of redecided. Every week we revisited that decision whether or not to go public, depending on what was going on in the case and depending on what was going on globally. And we eventually found out that he was being held by the Haqqani network, and we really felt that he wasn't being held by a legitimate government, that they wouldn't succumb to moral pressure. The Times correspondents in Kabul spoke to the kidnappers early on and tried to say, you know, he's a journalist, he's objective, please let him go. And they weren't going to succumb to that argument. So I really felt, as we received video communications throughout the case, that if we had gone public, he perhaps would have become a political pawn and a way for the Taliban to negotiate publicly. And I really feared that if they had demands we couldn't meet, it would end badly.
So who were you able to tell in this process?
Early on, our immediate family knew, but not extended family, not aunts and uncles or cousins. I was working at Cosmopolitan at the time, and they were fantastic. About 2 weeks into the case, I told the editor-in-chief and the managing editor, and they kept the secret. They kept the secret throughout. As the case dragged on, though, I had to sort of tell more people. I was new to the job, and I was a newlywed, and everybody would ask, you know, when is your husband coming in to visit? They'd ask to see photos from the wedding and whatnot. And it was hard to sort of keep a happy face, and I felt in a sense I was lying to people by not telling them what was going on, but it was for his safety and for privacy, and that was very taxing. In a way, there were so many people involved in working on our case. There was the FBI, family, we had the New York Times, we met with the State Department, we had a ton of people working on it, but it felt like a really isolating, I was very isolated in that I couldn't, you know, talk to co-workers about it or friends and things like that initially, so it was tough.
And you were dealing with so many different players in this in terms of the U.S. government, with the FBI and the State Department. You hired a private security firm. You were also dealing with the New York Times. One of the things I found very interesting is that you had to hire a private security firm. I think that many people watching this program might think, well, wouldn't the State Department and the FBI be handling the negotiations? But in fact, you yourself also were speaking at several points
to the
Taliban. So talk a little bit about that process.
The FBI is the lead agency on kidnappings of U.S. citizens, whether it's at home or abroad. And so very early on, they swooped in. They were the first people to contact me and to contact David's brother Lee about the kidnapping. They trained me to expect to take phone calls from the captors. We actually went through and practiced potential dialogues and whatnot. They had a script for me to follow. And the goal was for me to extend the phone calls, keep the captors talking, try to keep them calling. But the U.S. government and the FBI do not negotiate. They were unable to release prisoners. They would not exchange funds for David. There was a demand for $25 million and 15 prisoners. That was the original demand. And they couldn't really do any of that. So that left a vacuum, and we decided to hire a private security firm. And the goal there was, again, to have the captors call a representative from that team and have a back and forth, you know, dialogue until a reasonable amount was agreed upon. And we never came to that. In fact, the captors stopped calling those team members. And I would say about 3 or 4 months into the case, they started calling me at home, which was a tremendous responsibility. But there were also, oddly, you know, moments of absurdity. They would call me and they'd say, look at the number on caller ID, call us back because we're running out of phone credits. So in essence, they were calling collect. to demand millions of dollars in prisoners. I spoke with David actually about a week into the kidnapping as well, and at that point I had no idea if it would be the last time we ever spoke. So my goal on that call, just for us, was to sound as calm as possible and let him know I loved him, and I wanted to sound like I could handle the situation so he wouldn't be worried about family back home. But I also had to stick to a script and try to extend the call, repeat everything he said, and you know, let him know we were doing all we could but not make any promises.
To maintain your calm demeanor, your composure, particularly in speaking on the phone with the Taliban?
That was tough. I will say the fact that I had to call them back gave me a moment always, you know, to collect myself and to calm down. But really, you know, I guess I sort of shifted into a fighter mode in a way. And for me, it was just about surviving each moment, getting through each moment. I didn't really allow myself the ability, much of the luxury in a way, to kind of break down and cry. It wasn't an option, you know. I felt like there was a lot I had to do just to kind of be there for my husband and to manage different people. And so, you know, that sort of fighter, anger at the kidnappers kicked in and helped me keep going. And then we had tremendous support from family. My mother actually came in and stayed with me for weeks at a time. That enabled me to go to work, to, you know, be ducking out last minute to meet with the FBI, to meet with the New York Times. At work, as I mentioned, the editor-in-chief knew about the situation, and they were very flexible with me in terms of knowing that I would have to leave occasionally at odd times or come in late in the morning. So I really had tremendous support from family and from colleagues and from David's friends and colleagues as well.
Now, you both write in the book about one of the motivating reasons to write the book is to talk about some of the mistakes that were made along the way. What were some of those mistakes, David?
I talked about this a bit earlier. I think, you know, going to this interview was a mistake. It wasn't, you know, getting an interview wasn't worth the risk that was involved in that. Early on in the kidnapping, and Kristen sort of disagrees with this, the first night of the kidnapping, we were told by our kidnappers, and I frankly in the beginning wasn't sure who had kidnapped us. It turned out that it was this commander who would invite us to the interview, but they announced to us that an Al Jazeera film crew and a group of Arabs was coming, and they were going to decapitate all three of us and film it. I said, we're worth more alive than dead, don't kill us. And there had been cases where prisoners had been exchanged, like I talked about earlier, and there have been cases where millions of dollars have been paid. So they said, well, what will we get for you? I said, money and prisoners. They said, how much money? You know, and I said, millions. I think millions was maybe too high a number. Kristen's been kind and sort of said that that might have helped keep us alive.
In the early days.
But I would say those, you know, early on, those were two of the mistakes, you know, I made.
Any mistakes from your side, Kristen?
You know, hindsight's 20/20. At one point, I felt maybe we had too many people in the mix. I also wondered, you know, if we were reaching out to government officials, was that going to help him, or would that ultimately raise his value? You know, I think in the end, reaching out to the government was a good idea because it helped us get him out of Pakistan once he had escaped. You know, I realized midway through the case, or toward the end of it, that nobody actually knew exactly where he was, and that was terrifying. And you know, as I say, like, every case is different. I think streamlining it is a good idea, but yet the other outreaches we did turned out to help us in the end. So.
And David, if you wouldn't have escaped, where do you think you'd be right now?
Oh, I think I'd still be there. The Taliban today have a safe haven in the tribal areas of Pakistan. I was in an area called North Waziristan. The Obama administration has repeatedly asked the Pakistani military to move in there. They have refused to do it. Faisal Shahzad, the young man that tried to set off the truck bomb in Times Square that didn't detonate, he was trained in this exact same place. And the other young man, Najibullah, who was trying to set off something in the Zazi, who was trying to set off something in the subways of New York, he was trained in North Waziristan as well. So this is a direct threat to the United States and to New York. And, you know, I would still be there because the Taliban have this mini state where they can hold prisoners. They plan and carry out attacks against U.S. forces and Afghan forces and Pakistani government forces from there. And it's, you know, really disappointing that the Pakistani military has not confronted the Taliban yet.
So what can be done about that? Because you are one of the few people who unwittingly infiltrated the Taliban and probably has some of the best personal expertise as an American in dealing with the Taliban. What can be done to fight the Taliban? I mean, and a lot of times I think Americans think of the Taliban as one monolithic entity, and you pointed out in your book that there are a lot of different tribal factions even within the Taliban. So what can be done in terms of American foreign policy to fight that?
I think there are three things, and you're right, there are many different Taliban. I was among the most hardline. I would say three things. One is there are ways, and there should be attempts to negotiate with moderate Taliban. There are Taliban inside Afghanistan that are simply fighting for control of their valley or their village. They might compromise. The second thing would be the reason Pakistan is backing the Taliban is that it's their rivalry between India and Pakistan. They feel that India has sort of taken control of Afghanistan, and then Pakistan is using the Taliban as proxies. So if there could be a diplomatic push that would get India and Pakistan to reduce their tensions and then to get these safe havens eliminated, that would help. And then the last thing I would say is to train Afghan security forces. We trained roughly 3 times as many soldiers and police in Iraq as we have in Afghanistan, and the two countries are roughly the same size. So the key thing is to kind of, you know, support moderates, give them security forces, give them funding over the long term, and then slowly withdraw American forces. Things have improved militarily under this surge. Things are much better in southern Afghanistan, but it's just, you know, a surge of troops isn't enough. You've got to, you know, deal with India, you know, negotiate and train are the key elements, and I think, you know, you can create long-term stability there.
David Rohde, Kristen Mulvihill, thank you so much for being here and telling us your story.